Earlier this week, one of the worst discoveries we could have possibly found was made in Spire 2 by long-standing community member TCKMN, and it has to do with two dreaded words: correlated randomness. If you're aware of what those two words mean, you probably already know just how big of a deal this actually is. If not, don't worry, I'm going to explain it very shortly. The goal of this video is really to make people aware of the problem, but more importantly, make the devs aware so that they can fix the issue. TCKMN was kind enough to give me access to their blog post early so that I could make this and upload alongside them. So thank you again to them. That blog post will be linked in the description down below, and we'll cover a lot of the actual nitty-gritty behind the why of the stuff that we're going to be discussing today. I will give one final warning that until this is fixed, this is something that can legitimately ruin the gameplay experience for you and definitely falls under the category of forbidden knowledge. Once you know it, you can't unknow it. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Here are three true statements about the game of Slay the Spire 2. 1, if you pick Neow's bones in Underdogs, the random curse is 54% likely to be dead. 2, it is impossible to receive rebound from the Trash Heap event. 3, your first fight is 76% likely to drop a potion in Underdogs, and 4% likely to drop a potion in Overgrowth. Obviously, all three of these have massive gameplay implications, and if you are coming from Spire 1, you may have been aware of a mod that players were using at the end of that game's lifespan called RNG Fix. And what that mod did was essentially remove these sorts of interactions from Spire 1. However, going into Spire 2, the devs promised us that they were going to attempt to remove correlated randomness from the game. However, it is very clear now that they have failed in doing so. What correlated randomness actually is perfectly described by this last sentence here. It's that knowing the first output of one of the game's RNGs gives information that helps predict the first output of all of the others. And this obviously shouldn't be possible in a game like Slay the Spire, but it's an unintended side effect of a computer's inability to actually be truly random. I'm not going to be going into too much detail about the coding jargon, about C# in this blog post, but if you're curious about that, feel free to read it. I just wanted to focus on keeping this digestible for someone without a comp sci background and really talk about the gameplay implications and what it means for the player. Because of this, I will be skipping over some of the more math and coding focused sections and getting more to the what is actually happening because of it. So let's go ahead and skip down below. This section is mostly focused on the coding side of things and what the devs did to try and fix the issue for Slay the Spire 2, but I think there's one really important line to bring attention to, which really highlights the actual reason why this is an issue that needs to be solved. And it says, a crafty player could therefore pay attention to the results of past random events and gain information about future random events. When events are predictable, or the outcome of certain RNG checks are predictable, the optimal way to play the game becomes looking forward at everything you can possibly predict and reevaluating your decisions with new knowledge. And Spire is a game where I think it's very clear that the intended gameplay is not that. You're not supposed to be able to know what's going to happen in Act 2 based on Act 1. You're supposed to have a limited scope of the amount of information that you can have and make decisions with hidden information. When that is not truly hidden, but it's hidden behind a wall of I need to go look at a spreadsheet and figure out what my possible options are now, it becomes a game that mostly gets played in a Google Doc instead of actually inside the game, which is just a very different experience. This warps the gameplay experience from floor 1. We jumped ahead here to look at Neow's bones, and this is a Neow relic that gives you a random curse. However, it's clear from looking at this that the curse is not actually random. It's actually impossible to even get certain outcomes. So for example, in the Underdogs, you have a 54% chance of getting debt and a 40% chance of decay. The only other curses you can even get from this option are Clumsy at 0.1%, Doubt at 1.5%, and Writhe at 3.8%. I think it's very obvious that if you know you're in the Underdogs and you have this option, you don't want debt. Some of these curses are not like the others. The best curse you can possibly get here is definitely Clumsy, and when that is at such a small fraction compared to one of the worst curses to see on floor 1, you can start to see the issue. Now this option just becomes a lot worse if you load into Underdogs. Conversely, if we look at the overgrowth statistics here, you can see that it's actually impossible to receive debt at all. You get Writhe at 73.74%, which is essentially just 3 out of 4 times. When you are looking at this option, now the outcome is not that you get a random curse and can high roll, it's that you essentially know you're getting 2 options here for your curse and a 3rd or 4th option at an extremely unlikely rate. You can essentially go into the map knowing how bad is it that I have debt here, or how bad is it that I have ride, then I can worry about how to deal with those problems. And again, this is just the absolute tip of the iceberg when it comes to what you can predict. TCKMN actually compiled a list of people complaining on Reddit about getting horribly bad luck, as in getting debt as their starting curse way too frequently. You can see 1 in 12 million Neow's Bones odds, and now we know that this is actually not, in fact, 1 in 12 million, even if that's what it's intended to be. At this point, you might be thinking, doesn't that mean we can predict the randomness of every Neow relic? And indeed, we can. Starting with Large Capsule. The first relic from Large Capsule is never common. I think it's very clear to understand why that is a massive buff to this Neow option, but funnily enough, it also says, more specifically, in Overgrowth, it's about 70% to be uncommon and 30% to be rare, and in Underdogs, about 37% to be uncommon and 63% to be rare, with one caveat. Large Capsule only appears 1.65% of the time in an Underdogs act, because everything is correlated with everything. When trying to assign strength and figure out how good things are in this game that have random outcomes, every player up until now has been using the assumption that the outcome is truly random and that the distribution is even. And when information like this comes out, it makes it very clear, one, that we are going to be very wrong about how strong something is because information has been hidden from us. And second of all, the patterns and things we've learned from clicking these options, once they get fixed, are going to be very wrong. So if you feel like Large Capsule has been doing really well for you, that's probably because it has been. Going forward, that may not actually be the case. So we're going to have to reevaluate essentially everything, especially these Neow options that have been so warped and have never really truly been random. If we look at the actual available pool of Neow options to see in an Underdogs act, you'll see there are some very obvious outliers here. These should all be the same value, but you can see that Hefty Tablet and Large Capsule are only seen at 1% both, while Precarious Shears and Silken Tress seem to have taken the percentages that were devoted to those 2 aforementioned options and gave it to themselves. So you see Precarious Shears and Silken Tress about twice as often as all the other options on this list, which can have huge implications for how difficult this act is supposed to be for certain characters, given that Precarious Shears are basically never clicked on some and very good on others, and the recent nerf to Silken Tress. Changes for these Neow options could basically make these acts way harder or easier than they're supposed to be, as an unintended consequence of them just being seen way more often in those acts. And for Overgrowth, you can see a sort of similar effect has happened, except it's taken Precarious Shears and Silken Tress and instead given those percentages to Hefty Tablet and Large Capsule, essentially completely reversing the probability that you're going to see these based on the act that you're actually in. What about Small Capsule? Unlike the previous example, looking at whether you're an Underdogs or Overgrowth doesn't tell you how good Small Capsule is going to be. Rather, you can look at the third option from Neow when you also have Small Capsule on the screen and use that to determine how good this Small Capsule is going to be. So if you're an Underdogs, for example, and Hefty Tablet's also on the screen next to your Small Capsule is guaranteed to provide an uncommon or rare relic, which is obviously a huge deal compared to only being able to see common relics from Neow Bones, Precarious Shears, Silken Tress, and Silver Crucible in Underdogs. And if you compare that to something like Cursed Pearl in Overgrowth or Hefty Tablet or Leafy Poultice, you're again guaranteed to see uncommon or rare relics out of your Small Capsule, which is a massive, massive buff to this relic, which completely warps the strength of this Neow option and how often you should be clicking it. Again, I hope you can start to see the issue with this and why it really needs to be fixed, because if I'm trying to play for, let's say, a world record streak, I am going to want to use this information. It's going to be very difficult to not use what's given to me and what is fair game, essentially. Once you look at this, there's no way to unknow it. The only hope really is that the developers just patch it out and we don't have to worry about this sort of thing going forward. Let's move on to Leafy, Poultice, and Hefty Tablet, which are Transform 2 and Choose a Rare. These should be completely random from the available pool of options. So for Hefty Tablet, you should be pulling from the entire rare pool, and Transform 2 should pull from the entire pool of available cards, which is 80 on each character. Unfortunately, the first Transform can only be one of 22 possibilities with significantly differing odds. So looking at this graph here, you can see the available Transform pool for Underdogs, which again, should pull from the entire pool, but you can see that this is only a handful of cards here, and some of them are significantly more likely than others. We can use this to determine whether or not we actually want to click Transform. And if we tab through, you can see that every character has the same issue. Some of them are going to be significantly better than others. Silent, for one, looks extremely good option-wise, and as well as Regent. But something like Cloud really doesn't have great options here. Just knowing that certain cards here are more likely to appear than others really warps your want to click on this, especially in difficult looking maps, and gives you way more information than you're supposed to have. I'll quickly tab through the overgrowth options here for each character, and you can see that they're extremely different and also much more heavily weighted towards certain cards. So this grouping at the bottom here at like 7.8% likelihood is usually what you're going to be getting here. That, again, huge deal. I don't think I have to explain really why that is when you know what your transforms are going to be, or in this case, at least one of your transforms is going to be. That is not a good thing. Similarly, the first option from Hefty Tablet only has 11 possibilities in Overgrowth and 3 possibilities in Underdogs. This is partially because it only appears in 1.3% of Underdogs acts in the first place, and so seeing it at all is very strong information on what you're going to get. So again, we can look. It looks again like Juggernaut is just going to be the card you're going to be seeing. Knife Trap for Silent, Heirloom Hammer for Regen, Reaper Form for Necro, and Machine Learning for Defect. These cards, just knowing that they're going to be eating up a slot essentially with almost 3/4 likelihood, greatly warps the power of this, because oftentimes rare cards are going to be bricks for you in the early game, with some massive exceptions that can carry the early game very hard. And when you know that you're almost essentially guaranteed to see a brick, it makes it really difficult to want to click this over something that would normally never be clicked over it. Say, for example, like Remove 1, that generally isn't seen as very strong. But again, when you have more information, it completely warps the strength of these relics and how often you should be clicking them if you're trying to win as much as possible. Moving on to New Leaf and Arcane Scroll, which are Transform 1 and Random Rare respectively. As a small capsule, both the Act and the Curse Pool option influences these relics. And the Curse Pool option is that third relic in your Neow relic selection screen. And TCKMN says, including an entire list of cards for 14 combinations of Act and Curse Pool relics would take up way too much space. So they'll just say you can narrow the possible transforms from New Leaf down to anywhere from 4 to 39 options out of 80, and the possible cards from Arcane Scroll down to anywhere from 3 to 12 options out of 25, depending on your Act and Neow. Going from 80 options to 4 or 25 to 3 in the most limiting cases is a huge deal. When you know that your transform is going to be one of 4 cards, it becomes very easy to decide whether or not that is good for you, whereas the variance that can happen when the pool is supposed to be out of 80, theoretically, is much greater and can provide, one, a better gameplay experience with more varied runs, but also just a less controlled gameplay experience, which again, I think is what the devs are going for. And it's not really important that we know what the cards are, but even knowing that this exists, again, if you're trying to play optimally, could make you want to look into this more and figure out what your options are before you click the button. And that, again, creates a really bad experience for someone who's trying to play optimally and can't just ignore the fact that they know that this information exists. At the bottom here, they say, let's be real, at this point, most of this isn't going to change the way you play. How about something else that does? A very bad omen. Lightning orbs and random targeting. This is something that actually existed inside of Spire 1. It was just linked to a different variable. If you looked at an enemy that had a variable amount of health inside of Spire 1, say a louse, that was supposed to have anywhere from like 9 to 18 HP or something, then if the number was odd or even, you could determine which direction your lightning would strike. Obviously, being able to play around the fact that your lightning is guaranteed to hit a certain enemy is very powerful, and one of the main downsides that lightning is supposed to have in the first place. However, in Underdog specifically, we can now know that your first orb is 75% to hit the enemy on left. And you can do even better by looking at the curse pool option, which is that third option in the Neow screen. You can predict with insane accuracy if the option was anything other than precarious shears or silken tress with a very small amount of Neow's bones as well thrown in there, then your orb is essentially just guaranteed to hit left. You can only hit the right enemy if you rolled one of those three aforementioned options, which is insane. Just knowing that this is a thing could save you a lot of HP or let you block when you otherwise would be taking damage can be no small deal at all. You can do even better in the Corpse Slugs fight, which has a randomized starting attack pattern. And they didn't list everything here, but if you saw Precarious Shears and the Corpse Slug on the right is debuffing, then your orb is actually 95% to hit the one on the left. By the way, floor 2 Corpse Slugs will both be attacking on turn 1 less than 3% of the time. How nice of them. This clearly is a huge deal for how you play this fight, how you micro it, how you approach it in general, and also warps the intended difficulty of the fight because the enemy is not doing the pattern that they're supposed to be doing at the same frequency. This also applies to the first random combat target of the entire run. For example, you can predict your first countdown proc on Necrobinder or your first parrying shield proc on anyone. Moving on to Trash Heap here, which is an Underdogs exclusive event. And you can see here that the outcomes are extremely biased. This is an event that usually I have been clicking the other option on. However, knowing that certain options are more heavily favored confirms kind of my bias on this event feeling not so great, because the three options you're most likely to get happen to be the worst ones. And it's not even possible to receive rebound from this event at all. The most useful cards here are like Hello World, Caltrops, probably, those two. And they're seen at way less frequency than some of the absolute worst in Clash and Distraction. And Dual Wield at this point of the run is also not doing very much for you at all. So if you know that these cards are better for you in your run, then it can also allow you to pick this and know that you're supposed to get these cards with higher likelihood. It's also noted here that you can predict the relic you're going to get because the relic corresponds to consecutive pairs of cards here. So for example, if you would have seen Caltrops or Clash from this event, your relic would have been Darkstone Puriapt. And this actually does confirm something I was feeling from this event, which is that I get Dreamcatcher more often here than basically anything else. And I thought I was just kind of seeing things, but it is nice to see that Distraction and Dual Wield is the highest amount of pairings here, which means I was actually correct. Not so happy about that, but I guess I'm not insane. Moving down, we can increase this accuracy of prediction by looking at, again, what your third Neow option is here. For example, with Hefty Tablet, almost guarantees that your card is going to be outmaneuver. Again, when you can predict this and look at cards here, essentially before you even get them, this event really turns into, do I want one of two cards or one card even from my options, or do I want one of these relics at also similar odds? Just really, really bad for the game. And again, I have hopes that this is going to get fixed. It is pretty fascinating to actually look at it right now, with the assumption that it's going to get fixed. If this is something that we have to deal with, I'm sure we'll come up with some solution. But yeah, hopefully it's just not going to last. Potion drops and question mark combats. Again, looking at your act and also the option that appears in that third slot, you can predict how often you're going to get a potion in the first combat, which is a huge deal for being able to determine whether or not you can go on difficult paths or not. You can see that Overgrowth has much less potion odds compared to Underdocs, and TCKMN mentions that the chance that your first fight drops a potion is 76% in Underdocs and just 4% in Overgrowth, due to the fact that some of these relics are very rare to appear in these acts, even in the first place. And also notes that picking any Neow that generates a card reward or random relic breaks this correlation, since it steals the first call to reward RNG. So Lost Coffer might look more appealing than average on bad Overgrowth maps. And this leads to another point of discussion, which is really this metagaming idea of you're kind of given a timeline at the beginning of the run now where you know sort of what's going to happen based on a few pieces of critical information that you get at the beginning of the run. If those things are bad, you can intentionally make decisions to shift the timeline and get off of your RNG seed to get to something that might be more favorable. If you know that this 4% potion chance in Overgrowth is going to be really bad, you can metagame and just pick a different Neow to call RNG. And yeah, this gets to be a complete mess, as you can probably understand. As a bonus, the chance that the first question mark room is a combat is also quite unevenly distributed. You can tell again that if you look at your third Neow option, as well as the act you are in, you can predict whether or not you will have a fight. Looking at some of these reading 0% and some of them reading not 0% is obviously a huge deal when it comes to how safe your path is. If you know it's just not possible to see a fight in your first question mark, that greatly warps your ability to take certain paths. If you also know that this question mark is a 41% chance to be a fight, it lets you path differently. Massive implications for how you should be playing your acts out. So far, everything here has only applied to Act 1, but you guessed it, we can go further. Starting with the Doll Room. The Doll Room is an event that appears in Act 2, but as with most events, it uses its own RNG, so we can correlate it with the first call to every other RNG. This overall is a huge issue, and I'm sure you will see as we move further along with this, but essentially every single event in the game is predictable in some way using CRNG. Looking at the actual stats here, knowing that the first option is very likely to be certain things, I think the main thing here is that Bing Bong is the worst option generically to just get, and this event comes at the cost of life. And so if you know, for example, that you clicked Hefty Tablet in your run, or Large Capsule, or even Leafy Poultice, you know that Bing Bong is not coming in your run at all, or if it is, it's at an extremely low rate. And so you can just click that top option to save health. If you know for a fact that your top option is going to be bad here, say with Silken Tress, and you really don't want Bing Bong, you kind of have to pay that 5 life. It shows which doll you get if you click the 1 doll option. However, 2 doll option can be determined from the 1 doll option as follows. If you have Daughter as your top option, your combination of dolls will be Daughter plus Struggles. If you have Struggles, it'll be Struggles and Bing Bong. If you have Bing Bong, it'll be Bing Bong and Daughter. And very often in this event, you are trying to get a specific doll. Often it's Daughter of the Wind. And again, knowing this, we can make a decision on how much life we usually have to pay in order to get the doll that we want, which almost completely invalidates clicking the 3rd option unless you absolutely need to. It just allows you to save a ton of health. This is literally saving 10 life. That is an absurd advantage to gain over someone who doesn't know this. The very last line of text here may be the most important. As a simpler rule, in Underdocs runs, the 1 doll button is 62% to be Bing Bong and 4% to be Daughter, and vice versa for Overgrowth. And this makes this option much more desirable in Overgrowth acts. In Underdocs, you essentially never want to click option number 1. Next up, we have the Crystal Sphere, better known as the Divination event. And this event is very often a horrifying event to see as a player, since clicking it randomly, you can just get a curse. But you'll see now that there is a way to predict where these options are going to be inside of this event. It turns out that the amount of gold your first combat drops is the second roll of the rewards RNG. This is some jargon, but essentially what you need to know is that by looking at the amount of gold that you get from your first fight, you can inform what the location of the relic is going to be at which frequency. So they've included this widget here that if I adjust, you can see the different layouts for the boxes and how often you're going to be able to click a spot safely, since the relic is never going to be a curse, right? And as you might have guessed, this is opening up a whole new list of things we can actually predict using the same RNG call. The most horrifying thing we can do with this is being able to predict which options we're going to get as our Act 2 Ancient reward. By looking at that first gold value, you're able to predict which option is going to appear in slot 2. This varies anywhere from warping certain options to be 2%. For example, with 7 gold, you're 2% to see Pale's Legion. And when certain relics here are way stronger than others and definitely build around, you can sort of treat this as scouting ahead and being able to build your deck in a way that takes advantage of this option, as well as something like Clone, which is mentioned here. We're able to also predict other ancients and different slots as well. So because some of these are more actionable than others and allow you to warp your deck building, we're looking at Tezcatar's option 1, which contains nutritious soup as well as hot cocoa. And if you know that nutritious soup is coming, you might not want to remove strikes. Otherwise, you may be inclined to pick up more draw if you're going to see cocoa with more frequency, things like that. I'm not going to go into like the particular implications of all of these percentages or anything. Feel free to open up the blog and look at this more closely if you'd like. Again, the point here is really that this is just extremely game warping in a way that is not fun or good for the game. This is particularly noteworthy and mentioned here that if Precarious Shears is offered, which is the remove 2 option, then Tez option 1 is 88.75% to be soup. So that essentially means that instead of removing 2 strikes, which should be the normal good option for a lot of characters, removing 1/1, like 1 defend, 1 strike, could be better, or just drafting around the fact that you're going to have soup offered to you and building maybe a more defensive deck because you know that soup can carry your damage, that sort of thing. Just really, really crazy. Here we're looking at Erebus, and I'm going to go ahead and skip to the most actionable thing here, which is Shrimp has an uneven distribution. This can allow you to pick a card that is only really good if you see Shrimp. For example, taking the Smith when you don't have the star economy to support it, but you know that you'll be able to play it, or decisions that you know will be able to be Shrimped, right? So again, things that completely warp your deck building in a way that just make the game different from the intended experience. The most horrifying thing about all of this is that it doesn't even stop there. And it's briefly mentioned here that in Spire 1, that correlated randomness would diverge rather quickly. It would get to a state where you couldn't reasonably predict things, and so it was only relevant for a very short amount of time. In Spire 2, that is not the case at all. It seems that almost everything in this game has something correlated to it, and so nothing is really truly random, and everything becomes very predictable. There's a lot more options and lists of things that you will be able to determine, and things that we just could abuse if we were really trying to maximize win rates. And you can start seeing how important it actually is. One of the funniest things is that the version of music you hear is actually correlated with some of this other stuff. And so if you're listening for the music track, that could cue you in on what your transform is going to be, like next floor or something. Things that you don't want to have to think about and will add unnecessary burden on the player. Again, I'm just going to like briefly scroll through this. I'm not going to go through like everything here, obviously, because there's so much. But I think you can start to see that looking at what we just discussed and how many things were problematic, imagine applying that to everything that can be random in this game. And you'll start to see how much of a chore it could be to play Slay the Spire. And that's, I think, is something we really want to avoid. They leave a plea to the developers here at the bottom, as well as a way to fix it, really. So it's really all there. At this point, it's really just making sure that the developers know this is a problem and it needs to be fixed, which is what I'm trying to do my part in and just blast this. I'm sure there'll be Reddit posts and maybe we can just DM the devs and hopefully get this patched out pretty quickly. I think it should be a really fast fix, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is literally hot fix like a day or two after this. I really hope it is, and it's something we can just like look back at in the future and laugh and talk about how stupid and funny it was. But for the future health of the game and wanting to play this game, you know, at least somewhat competitively and not have to think about these things, that would just be really great. So yeah, again, my goal with this was to maybe just bring to light about how abusable this actually is, and hopefully it's not something that anyone actually has to use or think about in the future. Thank you to TCKMN for allowing me to make this video and to have access to this blog post early before it's even published. It was just really nice of them to allow me to do that. And also, if you want to check out the blog, it's going to be linked below. There are other really cool Spire posts, such as the Spire exams on here, that are really, really difficult questions that test your Spire knowledge. So there's other stuff here to look at. I really recommend it. It's a fascinating read, and especially going back over some of the sections that I skipped here that talk about the coding reasons if you're a programmer or just someone who is curious about that kind of thing. Just super, super interesting. So yeah, I appreciate it, and I will see you guys hopefully the next time I do. This is completely removed from the game.